As the title suggests, my job here today is to discuss with you the problem of concealing one's faces in strategic interaction, and also the idea of outsmarting others. I have to admit that I've been always very much fascinated by the issues of mendacity and the problem of deceit. Probably because of its intrinsic complexity, first of all, but also because of its creative edge, right? So there is a clear connection between the work of creativity and the work of imagination from one side, and also the job of a very skillful liar. As was pointed out by Ruiz de Alarcón, a very good liar not only needs to have strong memory, but also a skillful liar needs to have a very creative imagination, and rightly so. But also Anna Arendt, she was very sharp on the ball when she pinpointed an element of creativity within the production of each lie. So the idea of lying, the idea of deceiving is somewhat interlocked with counterfactual thinking, with the capability of imagination, and with the idea of possible worlds, and with the idea of possibility. In fact, as she points out, and I quote from her book, Lying in Politics, the deliberate denial of the factual truth, the ability to lie, and the capacity to change facts, so the ability to act, are in fact interlocked, they are interconnected. So they owe their existence to the same source, which is in fact imagination. So I found this nexus a very fascinating area, first of all, hence my interest in the subject. But from here, then, how do we connect and how do we conjugate the problem of falsehood on one hand and the study of the human face on the other, which is the subject also of our ERC led by Professor Leone. Let me tell you that this is definitely a very complex subject, and also a very slippery ground. So what I'll try to do in this short presentation, I will try to offer you some suggestions rather than a full-fledged theory about these issues. So what I try to do is try to connect the dots in a sort of fil rouge, a sort of red line that connects somewhat arbitrarily, I would say, some authors and some theorists that have talked about this issue. And hopefully I will try to trigger also your interest and perhaps your criticism, let's see, on the subject. So one question that we should definitely ask ourselves is the following. Do faces lie? Very, let's say, straightforward question, but also a very tricky question. And there are different ways of conceiving the human face in terms of a false face or a fake face or a phony face. However, it is in plain sight that stricto sensu, faces don't lie, because lying has historically been conceived as a speech act. So if we want to be, let's say, quite strict and a little bit too precise with our terminology, we probably should say that we do lie by means of words. In fact, we do lie through speech acts, and therefore stating that faces somewhat lie in the literal sense of the word, that would be a far-stretched statement. But don't let me wrong, because human faces do play a pivotal role, a significant role in all settings of non-verbal communication. And therefore, for this reason, human faces can be disguised, can be dissimulated, and can be feigned. So obviously, there is a problem that needs to be unpacked there, right? And also, we should also remember that the idea of the subject is very much linked with the idea of persona, and persona, as you well know, it is linked with the idea of the mask. If we conceive of deception through somewhat the facial features, then we should probably put the idea of facial deceit in the basket of simulation, which is a non-verbal type of deception. Once again, let me be very clear on this point, because there is not a general agreement on such matters by the many scholars who have delved into this issue. So, for instance, if you take the, for us, famous semiotics of falsification and lying, which was formulated by Umberto Eco, he included lying and simulation in the same basket, in the same category of deceit. And he has distinguished this phenomena according to the house of the deception, so how deception is accomplished. On one hand, lying is accomplished through speech acts, and on the other hand, it is, let's say, simulation. There is a simulation which occurs not by means of words, but by means of actions and behaviors. Now, when we think of fake or false faces, probably we do immediately think straight away to something along these lines. Here is a classic example of a famous musician which is disguised as a street artist who is not recognized by the audience in an impromptu performance. This was shown in a famous Italian TV show, which is Report. And also another example would be a famous football player like Ronaldo, who performs his tricks in a place and who is disguised as a hobo or as a tramp. And in these examples, false faces would take the form of masking, of camouflage and of travesty. And this is one area of investigation also explored by some of us in the previous years. Now, since the title, a wonderful title provided to this symposium by Professor Leone, is Digital Pinocchio, which stems from a book that has created a long-lasting myth, I thought that a good place to kick off this presentation would be to provide you with a brief visual imagery around the liar, although this idea, this subject was already touched upon in the wonderful talk given yesterday by Professor Leone, so I will not dwell very long onto this issue, just a few words. So as it is well known, Pinocchio is a marionette, and in some other later translations of the book, Pinocchio becomes a puppet, and he was made by the dexterity and by the creativity of Geppetto, Pinocchio's father, who was indeed a very skillful carpenter. Geppetto gives life to a creature, we have seen it yesterday, out of a piece of wood, and from there Pinocchio starts a life full of wonder, full of adventures, but also, as you know, full of misfortunes too. Pinocchio is well known because of his nose, which is long and sharp, which gets longer and longer each time he tells a lie. But actually, this is not entirely accurate, because if we take the original tale of Collodi, then you will notice that Pinocchio lies 3 times, and he lies firstly to the cat and to the fox in order to hide 4 golden coins. Secondly, he lies to the fairy, and thirdly, he lies to an old man who asks him whether he knew a little troublemaker called Pinocchio, after the man suspected that this troublemaker had hit one of his schoolmates with a book on his head. And this is the 3rd time. So out of the 3 instances of lies, Pinocchio's nose grows only on 2 occasions. But anyway, we do recognize this long nose as symbolic, as a symbolism of the liar, at least in Western culture. So I entirely agree with what was said yesterday. If the physiognomy of every liar's face would change at the speed and at the magnitude of Pinocchio's nose, also outside the fictional world constructed by Collodi in his magnificent book, then we would be in a much better place than we are today. To catch a liar is not at all an easy task, and everyone who has been lied to at least once in their life knows and is aware of this point very much. Long noses or short legs. Now, from Pinocchio, let us move back a few hundred years. Ancient iconography depicts the lie as being sometimes limp and sometimes as holding a mask in its hand, in order to show exactly that the lie has indeed a double face. This idea was epitomized in Augustine's well-known characterizations of the liar as being duplicitous. The lie has two faces because, as Saint Augustine pointed out, the liar has a cor duplex, so two hearts, a double heart, as Augustine would say. The integrity of a person resides then in the alignment with his own heart, whilst in the lie, there is then a gulf, there is a mismatch between inward thoughts and outward speech. If we want to translate this concept in a modern characterization, then we can use the concepts of congruence and authenticity. For example, Carl Rogers, the psychologist, pointed out that there is something called subception. And the subception is a sort of sixth sense, bottom-up bodily feeling, which can be used to determine whether a subject is being incongruent or inauthentic. If we go back to the iconology of Cesare Ripa, the lie is depicted as limp, and the dress of the woman shows several faces, several masks. Likewise, if we take a look at the frog, this is represented as a woman with two faces, one young and one beautiful, and the other one old and ugly. From the side of the face of the younger woman, the figure holds in its hands two hearts, exactly as Augustine had pointed out, so the symbol of duplicity. And from the other side, from the side of the old woman, the hand holds a mask. If you pay attention to the lower part of the figure, the legs of the figure end with clothed feet, whilst behind them you can glimpse from the dress of the frog this stinger tail like a scorpion. I cannot dwell longer. I have to go quite fast to be able to say everything I want to include in this presentation. But the idea, just let me tell you that the idea of the multiplication of the faces is present in many representations, as for instance, the allegory of Prudence painted by Titian, where we have three faces, the faces of an old man, the faces of a mature man, and the faces of a young man, which are coupled with the three heads of animals below under the figure. We have a wolf, a lion, and a dog, the symbols of the time that the sage is able to master by learning the lessons from the past experience. And this is the old man wolf, or in order to act prudently in the present, this is the man lion, and in order to lay the foundations for the future, and that's the young man and the dog. If we take a look at physiognomy, what we find in there, we find what follows. For example, that in men's representations of faces, a weak or receding chin should signify falsity for some reason. A good example of such association of ideas can be found in John Caspar Lavater's Physiognomics. in which a receding chin coupled with very tiny and astute eyes indicates somewhat the lack of sincerity. What's the point? The deception of the depiction of the liar based on the facial features as depicted in the physiognomy is very much wobbly ground. Physiognomy has often provided false representations of types and characters which have triggered a very harsh response of scholars, very eminent scholars such as Georg Lichtenberg and Rudolf Kastner, who have pointed out numerous flaws of such false representations or of false faces. It is not a mere coincidence that I concluded this brief excursus of the imagery of the liar by mentioning Johann Caspar Lavater. In fact, there is a very important turning point in the history of physiognomy that bears significance for the subject I'm discussing here today. This turning point occurs in the debate around the human face between two distinguished scholars, Johann Caspar Lavater indeed and Georg Lichtenberg. There is a key distinction which I think is very useful for us in this debate, that is the difference between physiognomy on one hand and pathognomy on the other hand. Whilst physiognomy is the study of the fixed or static traits of the face, then pathognomy on the other hand is concerned with the study of the dynamic, of the mobile facial features. And I would say that this point is very much worth pondering. The breakthrough of Lichtenberg is quite a revolution in this history in this cultural history of the face. In fact, for the first time, the human face takes on a dynamic dimension, which not only entails the possibility of change and the possibility of transformation, but includes mutatis mutandis also the capability of deceit, the capability of cunning and manipulation. The debate between Lavater and Lichtenberg not only marks then a turning point in the history of physiognomy, but as I will show you in a minute, it also has some important ramifications for the idea of faking the face. According to Lavater, it is important to point out that physiognomy is conceived, in fact, as the investigation of the fixed forms of the face and the body, and as an objective and an ontological meaning that allows to know, allegedly, that which a man is. But Lichtenberg flips over completely this paradigm. In fact, he concludes that this idea of the study of the fixed forms of the face should be rejected, and we should replace it with the study of the mobile facial expressions known as pathognomy, which reveals not only what a man expresses, but also what a man simulates to express in a given moment and in a specific context. But there is more to it. The objective and the ontological meaning of the observation of the physiognomy should be switched with a subjective and therefore probabilistic meaning of the face. The distinction between an intuitive and a symbolic approach, which is probably of the physiognomy, and the practical and rational approach, which is proper of pathognomy, is an important distinction that's found is magnitude in this distinction between Lavater and Lichtenberg. So to sum up, with Lavater and Lichtenberg, the latter conceives the face as a category of time and of temporality and mobility. Now, during the last years of the 18th century, Lichtenberg was able to visit London and had the opportunity to study very closely a great actor such as David Garrick, of which Lichtenberg greatly admired this chameleon-like ability to change face through the art of dissimulation. In fact, the letters from England written by Lichtenberg revolves around the figure of an actor, which is the quintessential element of transformability, of mutability, and of dynamicity of the face. So I agree very much with what Gurisatti calls the chameleon-like man, which basically entails the possibility of changing face with will. In Lichtenberg, thus, there can be found a semiotics of passions, a semiotics of feelings, and a semiotics of emotions, avant la lettre. This semiotics of passions represents the study of the natural signs of the movements of the soul, in other words, the language of involuntary gestures and of mimic expressions. Now, the linchpin that should be drawn from Lichtenberg view is that not only the face becomes then the involuntary medium of an expression, but it also becomes the voluntary means of the representation of the subject. So in other words, face becomes the tool used by the subject in order to dissimulate his thoughts, his intentions, his state of mind, and even his own character. So Lichtenberg is quite clear onto this point, and I quote, "The mobile features of the face show and enumerate not only involuntary pathognomic movements, but also the voluntary movements of simulation." Here we come full circle. For Lichtenberg, the face is regulated by the I, the individual, who can not only manage to control his own emotions and their respective mimic expressions, thus hiding something that exists inside but doesn't want to leak out outside. But also the face, according to Lichtenberg, is able to produce facial expressions that are altered and artificial, and thus can simulate that which does not exist inside and must want to show outside. Thus, with Lichtenberg, we have the face used as a device of dissimulation, we can say. Now, from this, we can extract two opposite tendencies, and then from here, I will go to the final remarks of my speech. So we can sketch out two opposite tendencies in the discussion around the human face. Very generally, we can say that the first front conceives the subject as expressed by the unique expression of his own face. But at the same time, this trend towards the expression of the subject through the face is coupled with a counter tendency of hiding, of masking, of dissimulating this same expression. This dichotomy is evident in the research carried out by Jean-Jacques Courtin and Claudine Arroche, who singled out some paradoxes of the face, which you can see in the slide: expression versus silencing of the face, revealing versus masking, showing versus hiding. I fully endorsed the thrust of Courtin and Arroche approach to the study of the face, which should include not only the history of the emergence of the expression of the face, but also the silence of the face, so to speak, the way of controlling the face, of hiding the face, of silencing the face in different contexts, in different epochs, and in different cultures. And this perspective matches very well the expectations of a history of ideas and a history of semiotics too, that seeks to fill not only the history of presences, but also a series of absences of a particular idea of concept. From this point, I should now conclude and go to the, let's say, subject matter of this paper, which was the idea of strategic interactions. First of all, I should clarify that the idea of strategic interactions referred into the title is not, let's say, self-explanatory, so it needs some specification. As you know, this term comes from the sociology of Erving Goffman, and it means basically the games that people play in the face-to-face interaction. Probably a more straightforward, a more clear definition would be interpersonal strategies. So Goffman, as you know, have described such interactions in the following manner, and I quote once again: Each player must influence his own decision by his knowing that the other players are likely to try to dope out his decision in advance and may even appreciate that he knows this is likely. So courses of action or moves will be made in light of one's thoughts about the other thoughts about oneself. There are several types of strategic interactions. And here in these settings, the idea of predicting what the others will do is very problematic. Some examples are the following: two chess players, two poker players, stock markets and analysts and investors, military strategists, also lawyers before a judge or a jury, boxers, but also you can add, if you want, couples in a courtship, criminals and detectives, and perhaps also teachers and students, and spies and counter-spies, and the fourth. So in all these cases, each party in the interaction has a very strong interest in knowing what the other is thinking or how the other will react to any possible move, gesture, or statement. Knowing what the other is expecting or knowing how the other will react imparts a very important advantage in these cases. Commonly, concealing one's own plans and intentions also is advantageous to the respective parties in such interactions. A case in point is the game of poker. Poker is, by definition, a game in which deception is expected and constitutes the rule of the game. The expert poker player represents the quintessential manipulator. The professional poker player, in fact, should be able to conceal and camouflage his own real feelings behind a repertoire of deceiving behaviors. Disguising his true emotions is the hallmark of the manipulator as well as of the professional gambler. A professional gambler fits very well the phenomenology of the manipulator, as was outlined by the psychologist Everett Shostrom. The manipulator here would be the type of controlling. In fact, he is someone who uses deception, phoniness. He uses a host of tricks and techniques and play roles in order to create a false impression. Besides the proclivity to deceit, the manipulator, as well as the poker player, has a proclivity to control. As Shostrom pointed out, the manipulator plays games like a game of chess. He appears relaxed, yet is very controlled and controlling, concealing his motives from his opponent. The element of control is evident in the control of the body language and the control of facial expressions. A professional gambler is a player who is trained to complete impassivity, to show an impenetrable face. Indeed, the expression poker face refers to the ability of the professional gambler to hide somewhat his true feelings and to disguise his emotions in order to cheat or outsmart his adversary in a strategic interaction. Another key feature of the manipulator, as well as the professional gambler, would be the cynicism, as well as the distrust. He doesn't trust others and he expects to be deceived, so he must counteract to these strategies. Players of poker can use both verbal and non-verbal language in order to produce false expressions of weakness or strength, of expertise or of lack of expertise, even of luck or bad luck. In the game of poker, there is a sophisticated form of deception, which is bluffing. It was thanks to two mathematicians, John von Neumann and Oscar Mongenstein, in the book called The Fear of Games and Economic Behavior, that made the first systematic study of the subject. As they pointed out, of the two possible motives of bluffing, the first is to give an impression of strength in weakness. The second is the desire to give an impression of weakness in strength. I'll just now give you a few conclusions and then I'll open the floor for discussions. In strategic interactions where deception is part of the game, each party decides that the next possible moves to take according to the prediction made about the moves of the other are important. The strategy involved in such context set processes and skills of high cognitive order. The production of a successful deceit entails then a sophisticated set of assumptions by the deceiver, who must calibrate his own moves and tailor it on the base of the image of the other. There is a kind of mutual modeling between the parties in such interactions, calibrating and recalibrating plans of actions, anticipating and guessing the moves of the other, disguising and dissimulating intentions are part of the game. Whether the face in this game of skills can be entirely faked or whether it can be entirely read is an open question, but definitely it lets the game going. Thank you.